Thank you everyone for making this amazing series of exhibitions and conversations possible. I'm really delighted to contribute. Thank you. This short lecture or talk will focus on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and its recent turn to see evidence with their own eyes in cases involving indigenous peoples. It will explore how the ongoing case Pueblos Indígenas Tareri y Taromenane versus Ecuador regarding peoples in voluntary isolation challenges this newfound approach within indigenous cases. So seeing in the case of the Tareri Taromenane peoples in isolation is not only turning problematic in the form of site visits, but also most formats of visual evidence production, and more generally making the existence of the Tareri and Taromenane public. I'm basing my lecture in large parts on a 13 months long doctoral fieldwork I conducted in Ecuador and from which I just really recently returned. So it's all really fresh and not 100% like processed. As already mentioned, I'm a doctoral student in law at the Human Rights Center at Ghent University and part of a larger ERC-funded project which is called DISSECT, Evidence in International Human Rights Adjudication. My background is in architecture. While I was in Ecuador, I investigated the Sarayaku community's lived experiences of their court case in the Inter-American Court, which was against oil companies and the state's failure to stop them. And I performed the legal ethnography on evidence production in the ongoing Tareri Taromenane case. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights decided for the first time to visit indigenous territory in the case Pueblo Indígena Quichua de Sarayaku versus Ecuador, roughly 10 years ago, in 2012. So its judges could see with their own eyes and better relate to how the community experienced alleged human rights abuses within their culture. Since then, since 2012, the court decided to exchange their toga for a backpack in 5 more cases involving indigenous peoples. The Inter-American Court, just maybe to clarify here shortly, is one of the 3 regional human rights tribunals, together with the European Court of Human Rights and the African Court of Human and People's Rights. It is an autonomous legal institution whose objective is to interpret and to apply the American Convention on Human Rights, adopted in 1969 by the Organization of American States. So individuals and organizations that believe a situation is in violation of the convention that a state performed, so they think that exists, they can direct their complaint to the Inter-American Commission, which is the first step in the Inter-American system. The Commission can then recommend it to the court. The court can speak a legally binding sentence, and it's legally binding for those countries that ratified the convention, which are at the moment 25 countries in the America, excluding the United States. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights is considered very flexible in its admissibility of evidence. Next to evidence by alleged victims and the respondent state, the court admits evidence by witnesses, by expert witnesses, by other persons suggested by the parties whose statement, testimony, or opinion it deems relevant, Also, it allows for amicus curiae by individuals or organizations that work in related fields. And Article 59 of its rules of procedure enable the court to obtain on its own motion any evidence it considers helpful and necessary. And this is really distinct from most of the other international courts. And this passage in these rules of procedure also makes it possible for the court to decide to visit a site where alleged human rights abuses occurred. Evidence is, within this court, usually submitted in written format, but it can also include visual material. And within public hearings, testimonies can also be presented orally. What kind of evidence can be presented to the judges during a site visit is not specified, and thus provides a window to indigenous communities for presenting their truths in a format they choose. Judge Siraporto, when he was the president of the court, highlighted the benefits of on-site visits by the court. And it was in the case Community Garifuna Triunfo de la Cruz and its members versus Honduras, where he said that in his view, on-site visits are beneficial when facts of the cases are unclear, and the visit can be expected to yield evidence which could clarify them. He notes that in the previous case, Quechua de Sarayaku versus Ecuador, the court had identified the primary function of its in situ visits to be the obtention of additional information about both the situation of the presumed victims and the places where some of the alleged violations had occurred. In another case, he says that in the Garifuna Triunfo case, that the court was able to acquire first-hand knowledge on the local particularities in dispute, and that having heard from the people living on the land and local authorities, that this has helped to assess the existence of the violation. So the court thus seems really motivated by the opportunity to see the legal reality directly. That's how they phrase it. And clearly, like an in situ visit will make it possible for the court to appreciate aspects of reality it would otherwise have missed, and to gain insights which could not otherwise have been reached. But of course, access to reality never takes place directly without mediation, if only because of the different conceptual frameworks, past experiences, and current interests we all carry. In other words, the evidence gathered during a site visit cannot give the judges direct access to reality. Another aspect complicating the unfiltered perceptions of reality is that a site visit, by necessity, is preceded by a negotiation process, right? As of how this reality will be presented. The in situ visit to an indigenous community is meticulously planned by the communities and the lawyers in order to best represent their legal argument. The presence of language translators and anthropologists then is vital to make this information and what is seen accessible to outsiders of the communities, like judges are. What makes it valuable for indigenous communities these kind of site visits? So as we heard, like the first visits took place in the case Quechua de Sarayaku versus Ecuador. The case, the court visited the village, the main village. It heard testimonies of several community members in a traditional assembly setting. It participated in cultural activities and flew over the territory. It was the first time that victims were heard by the court in their own homes. Until then, community members always had been restrained to give their testimonies within the space of the court, as set up in its Western legal framework. They had to respect the rules of performance. The time protocol, and to them, even more than to other citizens, this was very foreign and highly intimidating. By contrast, the programming of a visit by the court to indigenous land is left to be decided by the community that is visited in its legal team. And also the fact that the local community is assigned the responsibility of the entire programming in itself sends a message of respect for local tradition and of interest in meeting and holding a dialogue, potentially at eye level. A visit to their territory by the court is therefore to be seen as a valuable opportunity for the community to introduce the court to the challenges they face and human rights violations they have suffered, to give them a glimpse into their indigenous traditions and values, and to have more communities members' voices heard. Another aspect is that oral testimony in the court is often limited to just one person, right, explaining what has happened to them. But it totally misses the traditional structure in which indigenous communities typically function, and typically also give their oral accounts, like typically recount their histories and share the histories, such as chant, song, and dance. Also, most importantly, Western court settings disregard the traditional rules of information sharing, which determine who is allowed to speak about certain information, right? We're talking about traditional hierarchies. A court visit makes to the community that is organized by the community makes these things possible. Also, it is considered not only to be have benefits on the legal plane, but also socially and spiritually, as it might provide a kind of closure for the whole community after a often really long, like 10 or 15 years long and taxing period of legal action on a national and international level. And in this particular case, this was even more so since the Inter-American Court's delegation was welcomed by the president of Sarayaku, Jose Gualinga, and he explained at the point of the judges entering the village that actually Sarayaku founding legend says that when the community originally arrived at the place where the current village is now located, they had the vision that wise chiefs would one day arrive to solve a serious problem the community would then be facing. Gualinga presented the delegates of the Inter-American Court as these very chiefs. So there's also a really interesting element here where the community tries to, the community links their history to some of the cases they are applying for. So to sum up this first part, in many cases, an in situ visit by the court is likely to represent an opportunity for indigenous peoples to share knowledge in their traditional format. And the Inter-American Court must be applauded for its effort to better grasp the reality and significance of indigenous ways of life. However, obviously, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that the simple act of seeing with one's own eyes during one single visit, during a few hours actually, could lead to a total understanding of indigenous realities, let alone to spiritual beliefs. Indigenous territorial cases are very complex. a one-time visit will never be able to provide the full comprehension of the community's realities. In this case, seeing with one's own eyes still means receiving linguistic translation and cultural mediation by both anthropologists and community members. And what the court delegation witnesses is always a carefully crafted program that has been devised in order to support the legal strategy. And yeah, it should be considered as another submission by the parties to the case, another piece of evidence. However, this is no reason to belittle its value. It's so far arguably the best means at the court's disposal for allowing the performance of different evidentiary formats, for softening the debilitating effects on witnesses of the court's hierarchical settings, and for attempting to make it possible to achieve something approaching listening at eye level. Now, the case Pueblos Indígenas de Guerrero versus Ecuador, which is currently litigated in the Inter-American Court, represents the first case on indigenous peoples in isolation. This court will decide on. So how does a case whose victims refuse to be in contact with the outside world change the court's approach to see evidence, right? The case Pueblos Indígenas de was brought to the Inter-American system in 2006 by a group of 3 individual petitioners that were then joined by the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, the environmental activist organization Los Unidos, and the young Tarmenane woman Conta, who was, I will come to that later. So she grew up in a Waorani community, in a neighboring community after a violent conflict. The petitioners of the case accused the state of Ecuador of having failed to protect the rights of the Tagari Tarmenane in isolation, affecting the territories, the natural resources, and their way of life. The Tagari Tarmenane peoples are the last peoples believed to be the last peoples in Ecuador that remain in isolation in the Amazon, in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And this ongoing legal case refers to 3 massacres of Tagari and Tarmenane people that occurred in 2003, 6, and 13, and counterattacks that killed neighboring Waorani woodloggers and settlers. And to make it even more complex, it also refers to the lack of protection measures in relation to the 2 Tarmenane girls that were underage Tarmenane girls that were kidnapped by the Waorani after a violent encounter. Kidnap is, however, not the right word to be used, since it is a traditional practice of taking the woman with them after such a conflict. The petitioners claim that the state of Ecuador failed to adopt measures to protect the existence of the people in involuntary isolation and the ancestral territory. And what they do is that they maintain that there is a clear connection between the legal and the illegal exploitation of the natural resources on the traditional territory and those incidents. Here we see kind of the follow-up of these different incidents. It was like attacks and counterattacks, where in total within 20 years about 100 Tagari Tarmenane were killed. Several Waorani members of the Waorani indigenous community, woodloggers and petrol extraction workers. No one knows exactly how many Tagaritoromenane people exist, but the number of 100 killings amounts to genocide. That's what the lawyers argue. Right. So backed by extensive anthropological studies, the petitioners maintain a very clear land bases have been drastically reduced by natural resource extraction, and this forced the Waorani to move closer towards the areas that the Tagari and Toromenane use. Some Waorani members also joined the extractivist industries for generating income, which only spurred the recent violent conflicts. Thus, even though the neighboring Waorani participated in the massacres, the state created the conditions for these killings to happen, and thus needs to be held responsible. The state, on the other hand, interprets the massacres as intertribal conflicts, an argumentation which allows the state to deny that this link between the extractivist activities and its failure to prevent them in these protected areas and the series of the deadly conflicts. The state has designated a restricted area and so-called zona intangible of 700,000 hectares to the Tagari-Toromenane that prohibits extractivist activities. However, as it is clearly visible by like this red crosses, which signify the different violent attacks and killings, is that due to the different reasons related to the migratory practices according to season and generational cycles, but also because they have, through extractive industries, they have moved from their traditional territory. They do not any longer reside within that restricted zone. Ecuador, the state of Ecuador, refers to the Tagari-Toromenane as people's involuntary isolation, which is a highly contradictory term. Anthropologist Roberto Narvaez, who has been working in the region for over 20 years, rejects it. He maintains the position that indeed Tagari-Toromenane peoples have been forcefully displaced by the incoming, first by the incoming missionaries, then the oil companies and the illegal woodworkers, whose practices altered and many times destroyed the natural environment, reducing the lands where they can practice their traditional lifestyle and forcing them to move further into the forest. While Narvaez omits the term voluntary, the investigative journalist Milagros Aguirre goes a step further, arguing for the use of pueblos ocultados, which can be translated as hidden, purposefully left in the dark. Aguirre argues that calling them involuntary isolation gives the state the opportunity to hide behind the apparent free choosing of being isolated, keeping not only their existence in the dark, but also the state's protection guarantees. While the state has created a so-called zona intangible to protect these peoples and grant the possibility for isolation, everyone seems to enter the zone except state authorities, who in fact should be preventing entry, let alone illegal logging and oil exploration. What we do know is that Tagari-Toromenane refuse contact. They leave signs of their presence, such as crossed spears along the trails, and they forcefully defend their habitat from what they perceive as direct threats. How then to produce evidence without violating their right to isolation and no contact? Anthropologist Narvaez holds that it is fundamental that the means or instruments of monitoring family groups in isolation be non-invasive. He says they must not involve overflights at all, nor the use of helicopters or drones or any other element, device or technology that could be invasive. must seeing then stand in opposition to isolation? Seeing must mean something else here. Certainly seeing cannot mean looking for the houses by the means of helicopters. It cannot mean walking expeditions, let alone bringing judges to this area of the rainforest. What we must try to see is how these people experience territoriality. What is it that they consider a threat, and which threats have come to define the territory? When a linear map based on the Cartesian grid is nothing they have ever even seen, how could this be an adequate tool to prove the threats they are experiencing and the new frontiers that they are created? What we know from the neighboring Waorani community is that the Tageretormenane are very disturbed by the foreign noises, which illegal loggers, the operation of oil pits, the vehicles on the newly constructed roads, and the settlers attracted by this accessibility create. Octavio Kauya, a Waorani community member whose village is now within the Tageretormenane migration area, told me in a recent interview, within this area, the Tageretormenane peoples don't want to have noises, foreign noises. For example, chainsaw, generator, or log saw. They don't like them. They told me in 2008, I went there to visit. There, a very, very strong man told me, we don't want to listen to foreign noises. We want to live quietly. We want to live with the sounds of birds and animals. So such as the Waorani people, the Tageretormenane, most likely do have an enhanced sense of hearing. Surviving in the rainforest requires a very detailed understanding of sounds, mostly animal and enemy sounds, their affiliation, distance, direction, how sounds travels within this dense and multi-layered rainforest. This need to survive in this way led to this special ability to hear compared to Western urban societies. So when foreign sound perforates the pristine rainforest, not only does it create a zone where to expect violent encounters for the Tageretormenane people, but also for animals, which are a vital part of their living forest, and on which they also depend on food. So sound must therefore be considered as a key aspect defining territoriality for the Tageretormenane, and therefore one of the possibilities also to represent the direct relation between the extractive industry's presence in the area and a series of violent encounters with people in isolation. So evidentiary documents that show how foreign noises change and reduce Tageretormenane territory is something I'm currently collaborating on with a group of geographers and anthropologists in Ecuador. Also a documentation from a documentation of how the changed migratory routes of the Tageretormenane made a change in the neighboring Waorani communities' daily life is a way to represent that. So the change is meaning, where they now can plant gardens, where they now can hunt, where they can use the rivers to avoid contact with the Tageretormenane. The tight schedule of this court case and the research and resources that need to go into the production of new evidence of this kind, unfortunately made it impossible to work through all of these complex questions regarding the visualization of intangible peoples in time for this to be submitted to the current court case. It was, however, intended and by the legal team. Surely they laid out the challenges and they started this thought process that is needed to radically change the concept of evidencing in cases concerning indigenous peoples in isolation. What the court, meanwhile, did in that particular case is that it is planning actually for a site visit to the neighboring Waorani community, since it can't be visiting, obviously, the restricted zone. So in this very first case on people in isolation, the court gladly accepted that the neighboring Waorani people who are in contact since the 1960s lent their face to the case and their voice to the peoples in isolation. Peoples that most likely are unaware of the case itself. Thank you very much.